Welcome to the If I Had More Time podcast hosted by Mariners Church. This series invites you into a casual conversation with our Senior Pastor Eric Geiger and our teaching team to hear a few insights and truths they wish they had time to include in the weekend message. We hope you enjoy it.
All right, welcome to today's episode of If I Had More Time podcast. This is Eric Geiger. This is a special podcast, this session. They're all awesome. They're all special, but this one's different because we are recording this before the sermon because we have a special guest that I reference in my sermon at the very beginning who wrote a book that I'm going to commend to you. It's called The Air We Breathe. Glen Scrivener. Did I say it correctly?
Scrivener with a hard I. Yeah, hard C, hard I. Scrivener.
I practiced it 17 times before. Scrivener.
That's it.
Glen Scrivener, who we've never met. This is the first time that we've ever really had a conversation, but our team reached out to you. I'm so honored that you agreed to come on the podcast. And the book, rarely do I read a book twice. I read this book twice. I think it's an incredible blend of theology, sociology, and history. So I enjoy all three of those lanes, and to see them come together, it was really insightful. And so I'm so thankful for your work. I can imagine, Glen, because of those multiple disciplines that are threaded through the book, that it was a ton of work. So thanks for all the work that you put into the book.
Well, it's fun. I love all that stuff too. So that's why it came out of me, because it was already in there.
Well, give us a quick bio, because I know you mainly from the book, but tell us you're Australian, but you live in London. How'd that happen?
Mm-hmm. I've lived, more than half my life now in the UK. My dad got a job while I was a teenager, so I did sort of high school over here in the UK, and then I did Oxford University here, and then I went back to Australia, and then I came back to England, then I got deported back to Australia, and then, long story short, I married a girl from Northern Ireland, and she thinks that England is halfway, and I let her think that, and so that's the secret of a happy marriage.
That's great, man. And so what do you do other than writing right now?
So I'm an ordained minister in the Church of England, but my day job is to direct a ministry called Speak Life. We're an evangelistic ministry, and that frees me up to do things like write books, or we've got a YouTube channel and podcast, and so we try to reach out online and speaking on university campuses, college campuses, and schools and churches, and training others to do the same. So we're an evangelistic ministry called Speak Life, and that frees me up to do things like write the Air We Breathe.
That's awesome. So that makes sense, because you open the book by saying, hey, there's three different readers. There's the nuns, the duns, and the ones. Can you give us that framework? And then I'll kind of share who I think our listener is.
Yeah. So on the census, there is now space for people to sort of write, no religion, and they are usually recorded as the nuns, the NONESs, and that is a growing share of the US population. It's a very large and growing share of the UK population. And so I'm talking to them, those who think they have no religion, and basically I'm saying to them, don't be so sure. I'm saying to people who might never have seen a Bible before, that book has probably shaped you in more ways than you can possibly imagine. And then I talk about the duns, the DONESs. Those are people who consider themselves to be done with Christianity. Maybe they're deconstructing. Maybe they've just casually de-churched. The Great De-Churching is a book that's come out in the States, I guess, about 12 months ago. And that talked about 40 million Americans have de-churched this century, which is a huge number. So there are a lot of people who are now done with church, even though in living memory they were sitting in pews and listening to preaching. And then the ones, the WONs, those who have been won by the love of Jesus. These are Christians who love Jesus, and I guess for them, I want to say, look, Jesus is not just a hobby. He is the Lord of all creation and the Lord of all history. And you can actually look back on the history of the Jesus Revolution with a measure of pride, not in anything that we have done, but in something that Jesus Christ has done in this world. And so I say to them, behold, look what Jesus has done in history.
Amen. So I think, Glen, the vast majority of those listening to this podcast are in our church and the ones. So I just meet them on the patio. I meet them when I go visit different congregations. They wish I preached longer. They're like, why is this show short? I'm so glad you have that podcast after, because they just want more of Scripture. They want to understand the faith more. But they also have friends that are in the nuns and the duns category. And it makes sense that you have a passion for evangelism, because I sense that this book was really helpful for people to understand how to articulate the Christian faith to someone who doesn't believe they have had any influence of the Christian faith, and you're able to show, hey, actually the world in which you love, or some of the values you love in this world, actually came because of the Christian faith. So if I'm a nun, and not an N-U-N, a nun, N-O-N-E. If I'm a nun and you and I are at a pub in London, and I say, man, tell me, I know you wrote this book. I'm not a Christian at all. I don't ever want to go to church. I don't even think any of it's true. If it's good for you though, man, if it's good for you, that's cool for you, but just not for me at all. How do you talk to me using some of the content in the book that, well, share with me why my world why the air I breathe is a bit Christian?
Yeah. Well, I kind of wrote the book for that person. There's a person in my life, I'll call her Sally, but she once wrote me a letter, and she said, of course, you realize, Glenn, I could never be a believer. And I just remember thinking when she said that, like, how untrue it is in a very profound sense, in that Sally had given, large chunks of her life towards charity, towards really self-sacrifice for her community. She'd traveled to Africa. She'd, looked after people in a school. She lived a life of other-centeredness in really the service of some pretty profound beliefs like beliefs in compassion, and beliefs in duty, and the beliefs in equality, and those sorts of things. And really, in my correspondence with her, I started to develop this language around belief, because I think a lot of the people outside of the church, they think of themselves as not believers, and yet they navigate their world according to some really core convictions about human rights and human worth and equality, about compassion, about freedom, about progress, right? And none of these beliefs have been the result of like a scientific experiment or a kind of a logical deduction. It's not reason or evidence that has led them to believe in something like human rights. It is far more this moral intuition that they take to be sacred, right? And they live their lives according to it. And so what I want to do in the pub with Sally's and people like Sally is to help them to see the ways in which they are already believers, and the ways in which the things they believe in are Christian-ish. So that if you believe in something like human rights, you're believing in really a secularized version of the image of God, which is there on page 1 of Genesis.
Right.
And even if your friend hasn't ever opened a Bible themselves, they have been so profoundly impacted by that. And that idea has kind of settled down into their hearts in a quite profound way, so that I try to take those beliefs and pull on them like threads, because I think on the other end of that thread is Jesus.
Yeah, I love it. So let's start with the human rights thread, or the equality thread, which is a real emphasis in the book of James, which we're walking through as a church right now. And so this weekend, when this airs, I will have just taught James chapter 2, 1 through 13. And I was reminded, reading your book, how crazy James's words were at that time, and how really these words truly ushered in a completely new way of life for many people. You talk about in your chapter on equality that the belief of the God story and the human rights story, they rise and they fall together. And you quoted from some non-believers that who actually articulated that reality, that those two rise and fall together. So we're in the pub. I love human rights. I'm not a Christian. I've never considered even becoming a Christian, but I do care that people are treated well, or that people are treated equally. so how is my belief in human rights actually a part of the Christian faith without me even knowing it?
Right. And you've got to be careful in these conversations, especially conversations in the pub, because you start to say, why do you believe in human rights? At some point, your friend is probably going to say, what are you, some kind of Nazi? I'm like, of course we all believe in human rights, right? But you need to get beyond that first kind of shock that you're not questioning whether there should be human rights. What you're
Right.
questioning is the foundation of those rights. On what basis do we treat every single member of the human family as the moral equal of every other member of the human family, no matter whether they're rich or poor, slave or free, Jew or
Right.
Gentile, right? Where do we get that idea from? Because nature doesn't teach you that. And that's why it's quite important in the book. I kind of go back to ancient ways of thinking. And, James chapter 2 is a great reminder of a very ancient way of thinking. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, you stand there or sit on the floor by my feet, have you not discriminated among yourselves? And James is assuming that Christians are going to say, it's a terrible thing to treat the poor in a lowly way and the rich in an exalted way. Actually, the whole thing about the gospel is that, he brings down princes from their thrones and sits those who are in the ash heap, like on thrones. Like, it is the tearing down of the lofty and the lifting up of the lowly is precisely what happens in the Lord Jesus, which is how
Right.
James begins chapter 2. And so what you see in the gospel is the utter inversion of natural thinking and ancient thinking. The ancients had a very steep hierarchy of being with the gods at the top, and you've got the emperor in earthly terms at the top of the pyramid, and the slaves are at the foot. And what you have in the gospel is the utter reverse. The Lord Jesus Christ, as James chapter 2, verse 1 calls him, is the Lord who dies the slave's death. And it's absolutely shocking to think of the cross in those terms, to think as an ancient person about what it looks like for not only a great king to die on that cross, but like the God of heaven
Right.
is dying on that cross. It is what the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called, it's the transvaluation of all values, like the turning upside down of natural values. The natural values are the survival of the fittest and the sacrifice of the weakest. And the gospel is the transvaluation of that. It's turning that right side up, we would say as Christians, that suddenly it's the sacrifice of the fittest, Jesus Christ, for the survival of we the weakest, so that we the weakest might survive and thrive and pass on a compassion revolution.
Amen.
In which the poor person comes in and you show them the best seat, and the rich person comes in and he can sit wherever he sits, and we're
Right.
not going to treat him specially. And it's that idea that is really a gospel truth that took a long time to sink down into our hearts. And you can see James, he wants this truth to sink down into the hearts of first century believers. And it takes a lot for it to sink down into the hearts of me, a 21st century believer. But as that truth has had its effect, it has rippled out from the church into secular society to the point where your friends and neighbors all agree that you should not treat somebody better because they're rich or worse because they're poor.
Right.
That is now considered to be natural, obvious, and universal. It was not natural, obvious, and universal to any ancient thinker, right?
Yeah.
And it's not natural, obvious, and universal if you just come from a purely evolutionary biology point of view. Where did we get the idea that we would act like James chapter 2? We got it from Jesus.
So, man, I love it. And your reference in the ancients, you mentioned in the book, you talk about some of like Plato. This would have been a crazy conversation for him, right? And yet we quote him a lot, Aristotle, that slaves are simply human tools. Cicero, famous Roman orator. All what James wrote, which we now agree with as a whole, was so countercultural in those days, right? And
Right.
you build that case.
Right. It's like justice. So I mean, Aristotle's work on politics is kind of like this foundational text. If you're going to study political philosophy, I did my first degree, like it was all about politics, philosophy, and economics, and Aristotle is laying the basis for this, and how do we think about natural law, and how do we think about justice? But the idea for an ancient thinker is that justice means enforcing the hierarchy that is already woven into nature. And doesn't nature already teach you that there are some people who are strong and some people who are weak? There are some people who are rich, some people who are poor, some people who are fast, some people who are slow, right? There are some people who are citizens and there are some people who are slaves, right? And nature teaches you this. And who are you to upend nature, right? And
Yeah.
justice consists in enforcing the natural inequalities that nature kind of shows to you, right? And therefore the gospel is a profoundly revolutionary kind of idea, because think of the Good Samaritan, for instance. With the Good Samaritan, what you've got is there's a guy by the side of the road and he's perishing. And an ancient person might look at that and they might just see it's a morality tale. There was once a guy, he was out late at night, he got beaten up. Don't be like that idiot. Okay?
Right.
And that would have been the moral that you learned from it. Learn your place, live wisely within your limits. That's ancient wisdom, right? But here you got this story in which the Samaritan, this enemy, comes and he performs an intervention on nature. And he lifts up a guy who was going to die. And an ancient person would think, well, who are you to intervene in nature? Maybe the gods want him dead. Certainly fate has wanted him there, right? Or maybe the village wanted to beat up on him. Like, who do you think you are?
Wow.
Trying to reach down into nature and pull up the lowly. Like, where do you get the idea that we're even meant to do that? And Christians come along and we say, I know where you get the idea for that.
Yeah.
There was this one guy, right? Who was the ultimate Good Samaritan, who totally did that. And we try and follow in his footsteps.
Man, that's fascinating. I hadn't made the connection. I did a trip to South Asia with some people from our church. We were in this global city, and there was this massive, at the time, one of the most expensive homes that had been built, huge, massive home. And it was right on the other side of where a huge slum in this global city is. And the people who were taking us on this tour, people were asking questions like, man, how is it that do the poor, impoverished look at this wealthy person and wish this wealthy person would help them? And does the wealthy person have any guilt at all that he's not helping these people in this global city? And because this group of people surrounding that area all believe in reincarnation and that, that to actually, for the wealthy person to intervene would be to thwart justice, because they would be messing up with the natural order of things. That the only way that people who are impoverished can get better in the next life is if they stay in their lane. A lot of them were outcast in that culture. And so that view of human rights, very different from the Christian view. So it allowed the person in South Asia to feel no guilt for not helping people who need help, because by doing so, that person would have been messing up the natural order of things.
Yeah. And two things to say on that. One is that, like, I live according to karma. I stupidly live according to karma every day, right? And that's kind of the rule of my flesh. And like I don't naturally want to help people either. And the second thing to say is that within the story of the Good Samaritan, isn't it interesting that Jesus casts the Samaritan as the good guy?
Right.
And so he totally tells the church, in these stories, the good guy is not the Bible guy, right?
Right.
The good guy is from the wrong nation and the wrong religion, and he manages to show the kind of compassion that shows everybody up. So, like, what we're not saying is that people in non-Christian religions can't show us up in the kinds of compassion that they show. And what we're not saying is that our moral fiber is any better than anyone else's moral fiber. But what I will say is we've got a story that is unlike any other story that is told. It's not like an Aesop's fable. It's certainly not like any of the Hindu stories about what the gods alike. It certainly doesn't assume karma. What it assumes is that the guy from the top descended down to the bottom in order to lift us up into this spiritual equality. And I don't think Christians are better than anyone else, but I do think the Christian story
Yes.
is so obviously superior to any other story that's ever been told.
I love it. I love it. All right, we're not going to be able to, for time's sake, get to all the chapters, but I do want to hit compassion. So you frame the book on the values that the Christian faith has really brought into the world that people who are not even Christian appreciate, from equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, progress. And so I do want to encourage the listener to get the book. We have the book available in our bookstore. You can also, we'll put it on the show notes. You can also, of course, order it online. Equality and compassion are chapters 2 and 3 in the book, which really flow well from the text that we studied this weekend. So I want to move over to compassion, which is chapter 3 in your book. You open with just a jarring quote and story from the famous atheist Richard Dawkins, which he obviously received some pushback from it, but he was this is a quote from him. He was referring to a child that would have not be able to, in his mind, live this really productive life. He said, abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. And so clearly Dawkins, the working out of an atheism is that this child is not, an atheist wouldn't say created in the image of God, so the worth can't be inerrant to who the child is.
Right.
And so a very different view from a Christian view of compassion.
Yeah. And so, if you believe in human rights, you believe that every single member of the human family is worthy of provision and protection, and that they are equal to one another in kind of dignity. And therefore we want to have a society in which, the little guy is looked after, and the rights of the little guy are not lost in the shuffle, and don't get sort of washed away by the dominance of the strong. And that's a really particular view that's come to us with a particular Christian heritage. I mean, what's interesting about all these debates is that the mask slipped a little bit with Dawkins. He was very brusque in that tweet, and therefore within the sort of the world of social media, people kind of they saw that mask slip, and they saw somebody talk about eliminating the weak,
right,
in the sort of the stark terms that Richard Dawkins often speaks in. What's interesting about the conversation around pro-life issues or whatever is, interestingly, nowadays in a kind of a post-Christian culture, all sides try to use the language of compassion and equality, because you can't really do what Dawkins did. Dawkins said what he said. Everyone was like shocked.
Right.
Even though, as he pointed out, 99% of parents in that situation do indeed abort. And he's quite right to point out, I'm just saying what most parents actually do in this context. But you can't say it the way that Richard Dawkins said it. Why can't you say it in the way that Richard Dawkins said it? Because we have learnt that compassion is supreme, right? And the
Right.
hashtag be kind is kind of the virtue that we have, even if we don't actually happen to live up to that hashtag. And so the virtues have been kind of detached from the Christian story and detached from one another, and they kind of run amok in the world. And so the most compassionate, the people who kind of claim to be, kind and compassionate, aren't always the most kind and compassionate. Have you ever noticed that? It often happens, but wherever you fall on these big issues, you cannot help but forward your position by talking about, it's healthcare, or it's about a woman's right to choose, or it's about equality because it's equality between the sexes, or whatever it is. Like, whatever position you put, even if the positions that you put are miles away from what the Bible says, people still manage to clothe their arguments in language that is Christian-ish, even as they might, push views that are very far from what the Bible says. So we're living in this sort of post-Christian culture in which there are a whole bunch of Christian-ish intuitions, but they've been divorced from the Christian story and divorced from one another. And that's another reason why I wanted to do a deep dive into the history, just so we can go back to the original and compare what the propaganda says with the original Jesus Revolution and make sure that we're true to that.
Yeah. So going back historically, I know you've studied history a lot. It comes out in your book. So we know that Christians were a part of stopping the gladiator games in Rome. We know that early Christians rescued children from infanticide in the Roman Empire. What are some high marks that you point to from a historical perspective of, man, here is where Christians really, the compassionate revolution happened? What are some things that, as you've read history and as you've studied, that you're like, wow, there really was a shift here because of the Christian faith?
Oh, it's just so much, Eric. It's just so much. I did a talk recently in Australia where I just it was mainly it was a secular audience, and I just said, let's forget the title of the talk that I'm meant to be giving. Let's imagine that this is the inaugural meeting of the Society for Human Progress. Here we are. We're at the Society for Human Progress, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to ask who should be voted into membership of this society. And I asked the person in the front row, what's your name? I said, you're Jim. Okay, Jim. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, Jim. Jim actually invented the concept of charity. And I'm not just saying he runs a charity. I'm saying he's actually the society that he represents, the organization that he represents, like brought charity into the world, the concept of charity in that kind of sense. Who thinks that Jim and his organization has a seat at the table in the Society for Human Progress? All in favor say aye. The whole room says aye. Okay, and then I just move along and said, this person ended the gladiatorial games. Who thinks that this person's organization, belongs in the Society for Human Progress? All in favor say aye. This person outlawed child sexual abuse. It was known by the Greeks as pederasty, which in Greek means child love. Christians called it child destruction. And they outlawed it and brought in legislation when they were in a position to do that. Who thinks that this person should, have a seat at the table in the Society for Human Progress? All in favor say aye, and they all say aye. And then I go through. This person ended infanticide. This person started orphan care. Who thinks they deserve a seat at the table? This person invented hospitals. Who thinks they deserve a place in the Society for Human Progress? This person invented hospices. Who thinks they, this person. And then you go through, this person invented the whole conceptuality around human rights. Who thinks, they belong. This person helped end the slave trade, right? The transatlantic slave trade. Who thinks, and of course the punchline to the whole thing is, when I ask Jim and everybody else to declare which organization they represent, Jim says the Church of Jesus Christ. The next person says the Church of Jesus Christ, 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 the Church of Jesus Christ. Like hands down,
That's
the
beautiful.
Church of Jesus Christ is the greatest movement for compassion.
That's so beautiful, man.
For human progress in history. Of course it is. I mean, it's not even close.
That is so beautiful. I love it. All right. Well, I want to get to the last question, which you hit in the end section of your book, and it's a fascinating question I've heard some people debate, which is what happens when you have a culture that values some of the values that Christianity has brought into the culture. So we have, for the most part, equality is valued, compassion is valued. Those are words that, as you mentioned, different people use for different reasons, but those are words that people think are beautiful words. But what happens over time when the reason that we have those values, Christ, is rejected? You phrase it this way: what happens when you want the kingdom without a king? And so what does happen? What happens to a society? I know that maybe we don't yet know the full trajectory. You and I were talking before we started that Nietzsche kind of wondered what would happen, or hoped it would happen, hoped that a culture would reject Christ and therefore the value of equality would cease to exist. I'm assuming that you've thought about this question a lot because you've hit it from both the sociology and a theological perspective. But what does happen?
Yeah. Can you get the fruits without the roots?
Right.
And we have been detached from those roots. And I think what we've seen is the fruits of the Jesus Revolution end up in things like equality and compassion and consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. But then when they get divorced from the Christian story, they then exist as these abstract values or virtues that then become almost kind of like baseball bats that you use to club other people with, because I'm the compassionate one.
Right.
And the political situation in the UK is very different to the US, but right now euthanasia is being discussed quite a lot because there's going to be a free vote in Parliament about whether euthanasia assisted dying will be rolled out throughout the United Kingdom. And what's interesting is on both sides everybody's talking about compassion, and on both sides we want to tell stories of the victim and we want to look after the victim, right? Where do we learn that idea from? We learned that idea from Christ, right? But the side that really wants assisted dying and euthanasia is wanting to find a certain kind of victim, and here is the person with like terrible suffering and our hearts, and what are they doing at that moment? They are wanting us to resonate with the pain of the marginalized, of the person who is weak, right? That they are absolutely identifying a very Christian emotion that all of us in society have. But I think for those of us on the other side of the debate and wanting to uphold the sanctity of life all the way through, I think we want to identify a different kind of victim. And what about the disabled? And what's this going to do for the infirm? And what's this going to do for people who feel like they're just a burden, and they want to bump themselves off anyway. And so on our side of things, we're trying to identify victims which we think are the deeper victim, in a certain situation. But what we have in these debates is we're all hurling Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the references, right? And that can't go on for very long without actually having some more solid foundations underneath. If compassion is just a feeling that becomes a baseball bat that I use to beat you over the head, it actually becomes very fractious, it becomes very fragile, becomes very contested, without having a deeper vision of humanity and what we're made for, of life and death and rights and where they come from. And I think we need to get back to the roots of these things, or else we'll just have what G.K. Chesterton said, where in post-Christian society, we've just got the virtues running amok, right? The Christian virtues are just running amok. And it's a very contested space, and there's not a lot of forgiveness in it, and we become very judgmental, because if at the top of your hierarchy are just values, then values cannot forgive you. Values can only judge you. Right. And the only way I can feel better for being an uncompassionate, cruel kind of a person is to accuse you of being worse, right?
Wow.
And if I can accuse you of being worse, it makes me a little bit better because the value is at the top of the hierarchy. But if Christ is at the top of the hierarchy and the value is just the fruit of relationship with Christ, then thank God, Christ can forgive me. A value cannot forgive me, but Christ can forgive me. And hopefully I can pass on forgiveness in the world. And hopefully that takes a little bit of the temperature down in a society that returns to the king rather than just espousing the values of the kingdom.
So beautiful. Man, so well said. I'm just going to read two sentences from your book because we talked about both equality and compassion. When equality is divorced from the Christian story, it risks becoming a radical individualism. So obviously we don't want simply the value of equality to be top of the hierarchy. We want Christ to be top of the hierarchy. And then you said about compassion, when compassion is divorced from the Christian story, it risks generating competitive victimhood, which is what you're referring to in the debate. Yeah. And obviously we love compassion, but we want that to be the fruit. We want that to be the fruit of our faith, not the top of the hierarchy. We want Christ. He has to be. Only Christ can sustain the weight of being the priority in our lives, in our world.
Right. And I mentioned in the book, so C.H. Spurgeon said back in the 19th century that if you're half a Christian, you'll be the most miserable creature on earth, because you'll have the law but not grace, right? You'll have the burden of the values but not the forgiveness of Christ at the top. And I think our culture has become like semi-Christian like that.
Right.
And to be post-Christian is almost worse than to be pre-Christian, because we have these sort of virtues running amok and we don't really know what to do with them. We've become incredibly judgmental.
Right.
And it has not become a very pleasant place to be. So what
That's
Spurgeon recommends, I recommend. Let's have the full fat Christianity, yeah?
That's right. I mean, the virtues without the vine, without Jesus, will just crush us. We'll just be crushed. It'll be a new law. We have a new law that we can't keep.
Yeah. And I think that surprised people. I think Dostoevsky looked forward to a time, he didn't look forward to it in terms of wanting it, but he anticipated a time when we might be post-Christian. He said, without God, everything is permitted. What we're finding is that without God, everything is preachy, really, really preachy and incredibly moralistic. And actually, the invitation to Christ is no longer... I think we've got a new opportunity, but instead of inviting people into Christianity and people thinking, oh, that's the place where I'll feel least forgiven, I think we have an opportunity now because people know how unforgiving the world is. We have the opportunity of inviting people in. This is the place where they can finally find forgiveness, perhaps for the first time.
Man, that's beautiful. Well, man, this has gone longer. I've just enjoyed it so much than most of our podcasts. If you have got time, I'd love to end with just one last question, because I was going to open with this, but then we jumped straight into the equality and compassion, which came out of the text that we're in this weekend. But you open with the juxtaposition of the art of Christ on the cross. And the reason I want to end this is because we're talking about Christ needing to be the top of the hierarchy in our lives, and the root that which the fruit of compassion and equality comes from. I had never read. I thought it was so beautiful, Glenn. I mean, it was really worshipful for me reading it. I think you said it was in the Palatine Hill, the graffiti. Alex Amos worships his God, where it's clearly Christ with a donkey head, because in their mind in the Roman Empire, no God would die like that. And then now in museums all across the world, Christ on a cross is this beautiful picture. And so share the gospel with me through that lens. I thought it was just beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Well, it was interesting. After I wrote the book, I went and visited Rome. We did a documentary about it, and we went to the Colosseum, and we went around. We saw all these different implements of torture, right? And they were viciously imaginative in their ways of putting people to death. It was really, really incredibly cruel. And they have 40,000 people gathered together to see these blood sports that eventually Christians kind of outlawed. But as I was going around, I got to near the end of the tour, and there was a massive cross in the middle of the Colosseum. And even though I'd written the book and done all the research, seeing the cross, my first thought was, perhaps the Roman Catholic Church has a special way in with the Colosseum, and they managed to put this religious symbol into the Colosseum. And I'm just thinking, you're an idiot, Glenn. What a moron. It's not a religious symbol in the Colosseum.
Wow.
In the Colosseum, it is an implement of torture, right? And this is how we torture people to death. And for entertainment. And that is the way the cross was understood in Rome. Like, the very next place we went from the Colosseum was we went to the Palatine Hill, and there, scratched into the plaster, was this graffiti. And it's the most ancient depiction of crucifixion. Because the Romans didn't want to depict crucifixion. You shouldn't, the word, crucifixion should not even be on a Roman's lips, right? Said Cicero.
Yeah.
And so the first depiction was this mockery of the first Christians. It's probably from the 2nd century, and it's just got this Christ figure with a donkey head, and Alexamenos worships his God because they've got this sort of worship of holding his hand up in worship to Christ on the cross. And the spite and the vitriol of this caricature really carries down the centuries. And you see what it was for a Roman to understand the cross, because only a donkey of a god would descend down to this implement of torture. The place for a cross is the Colosseum. The place for a cross is not like on top of St. Peter's, the world's biggest church, that also happens to be built in the shape of a church and is filled with it's also, built in the shape of a cross with all sorts of crosses inside it. Like, what revolution has happened? And the revolution that's happened is that God himself has descended to that cross and endured the shame and the ignominy and the reviling of not just the people there at Golgotha on that Good Friday, but down through the ages. This Jesus has been placarded before the cultures of the world, all of which operate according to the flesh. My flesh and everyone's flesh just says that greatness is to be worshipped, and the servile and the low, the weak, and the botched, as Nietzsche would call them, are to be dismissed, and hopefully they are to be eliminated so that we can ascend and become, supermen. That's what Nietzsche wanted. And there's this very different thing. There's this one message. There's this one figure in history who comes down from on high in order to plumb our depths and go to the cross for you and for me. And that gets to the heart of an Alexamenos, right? Who's there in Rome. And no wonder the first people who respond to this message are the downtrodden. No wonder, because they see, here is one who came for me. He came all the way down to the rubbish dump to die the slave's death for me, and to raise me up and to say, hey, this is the way of glory, actually. This is what transcendence looks like. This is what God looks like, right? And it's this stunning idea that you go to a museum nowadays and you see the history of Western art, and it's just like 1,000 years of crucifixions, right?
Right.
For 1,000 years, we've just been painting this one scene over and over again, and we look at dozens of images of death by torture, and we all go, sacred art. What's happened to us? Like, we've been transformed. We've been transformed by the cross, and we now see divinity in a totally different way. We see glory in a totally different way. We see strength in a totally different way, because you've never seen anything more divine than Christ on that cross with his arms wide open to the world, bleeding for his enemies, saying, Father, forgive. Amen. That vision has changed everything. It's changed hearts, but then it's changed churches, and now it's changed the world.
Amen. That's so beautiful, Glenn. Thank you, brother. That was beautiful. Thanks for this work. This is heart-warming, heart-melting for me. I love that chapter about the cross, and then it makes me, when I get to the end, not want a kingdom without the king. I love the values of the kingdom, but I need King Jesus. I want King Jesus. Right. So I really appreciate your work. Nothing. No one like him. Thank you so much, Glenn. Thanks for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the If I Had More Time podcast, hosted by Mariners Church. We hope to see you next weekend at any of our congregations throughout Southern California or online. To view our locations and service times, be sure to check out our website at marinerschurch.org.